So Streets of Rage has been trending lately due to the recent announcement of Streets of Rage 4. It's been 24 years since the previous Streets of Rage installment was released, and so I thought I'd make a video about all three games, covering what they're all about, what you can expect, and just delve into what makes this series of beat-em-ups just so damn great, because the Streets of Rage series is definitely still good today. The side-scrolling beat-em-up was once a genre held in high esteem, and needless to say there were plenty of good ones, plenty of bad ones, and ones that excelled above all others. The arcade was the perfect proving ground for beat-em-ups, so while the likes of AVP, Final Fight and Double Dragon ruled the roost, what options did home users have if they also wanted to kick ass but from the comfort of their couch? Enter Sega, who developed and published all three Streets of Rage games from 1991 to 1994. In the first Streets of Rage game, you choose between three ex-cops, Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding and Adam Hunter, who've quit the force in order to face off against the evil syndicate via means of a tough vigilante justice. To start off, Streets of Rage is a great looking game, and while there are most certainly many graphically impressive games in the Genesis system, the atmosphere that has been created here is simply outstanding even before you start playing, as the introductory exposition rolls over the screen to the backdrop of a nighttime cityscape. Each level is introduced as a round, and as round 1 starts, a thumping beat ushers you into the game as you begin your ass-kicking journey through the Streets of Rage. The levels are wonderfully detailed, with the first round engulfing you in glowing neon signs and such that wouldn't look out of place in a retro future 80s action movie, and as your journey progresses you will end up in various locations such as a bridge and luxury cruise liner among others. Each sprite, whether hero or villain, is detailed and well animated, and the bad guys on offer are a varied cast of fighters and thugs, each with their own behaviors and quirks. As is typical with the beat-em-up genre, the screen will fill up with bad guys requiring you to kick the shit out of them before progressing to the next section. And you're going to have to stay focused in order to stop being overwhelmed, as while the enemies will come at you initially in their own groups, such as 2 or 3 of the same types, soon enough a diverse mix of thugs will be trying their best to kick your skull into the pavement, and of course there are also plenty end of level bosses to contend with, introduced by slickly ominous boss battle music which upon hearing it will indicate that some serious shit's about to go down. Apart from the array of martial arts moves at your disposal, as well as a screen clearing special move that has you call for bazooka wielding backup from the cops, there are various pickups such as broken bottles, pipes and knives that will give you an edge against the endless hordes of thugs. Just be wary, the bad guys can handle the same weapon pickups too, and some of them come equipped with their own weapons such as the whip-wielding leather-clad harlots. From Battletoads to Final Fight, it seems there is always a harlot archetype lurking about in beat 'em up, including of course the sweaty fat fuck. And with any beat 'em up worth its own salt, you don't have to go it alone in Streets of Rage. Team up with a friend or loved one, and it's double the fun as you proceed to kick the living fuck out of the various gang members and goons that would do you harm. Further still, depending on whether you play single or co-op, it's possible for the final showdown to play out differently depending on whether or not you take Mr. X's offer of joining him. Reject the offer and you will face off against Mr. X. Accept and you're sent back to level 6 where you need to fight your way back to Mr. X. Better still, should you be playing co-op and each player answers Mr. X differently, you will be forced to fight one another. And should the player who accepted Mr. X's offer win, he or she must then reject the final offer, resulting in a showdown with Mr. X, his defeat making you the new syndicate leader. I mean, damn, that's a pretty unique and complex ending for a Genesis title. Or any game for that matter. A lot of thought went into this, and it certainly shows. Streets of Rage certainly has its challenging moments. In this case for me it was these fucking twins that I only managed to beat with Blaze, and towards the end there is a grueling boss gauntlet as you have to defeat each boss yet again, and you're required to do so one after another before facing off with Mr. X. Overall, however, Streets of Rage is an extremely well balanced and rewarding experience, and even 27 years later, this game still holds its own. In the same way that Empire Strikes Back is considered to be the best entry in the original Star Wars trilogy, Streets of Rage 2 is revered as the best entry in the series, improving upon every aspect of the first game, elevating the beat-em-up genre to the next level, and really showcasing what the Sega Genesis console was capable of. The character sprites were larger, more detailed, and had a lot more animation, including character idle animation, something that was devoid in the first game. Each location and backdrop has been masterfully drawn and constructed, and whether it's an atmospheric, stormy downpour, a glistening city nightscape, starry ocean sky, or even something a little more surreal, like this alien-themed house of horrors, the levels are all highly animated and extremely polished, with the game opening on familiar territory as you start off once again in the neon sign-strewn streets. While the levels certainly have a distinct familiarity about them, oftentimes resembling upgraded versions of the first game's environments, somehow Sega managed to keep things fresh here, be it with the variation of the bad guys and obstacles you encounter, or by introducing vertical scrolling mechanics into the level design such as this. This time around, Mr. X is revealed to have survived his encounter with Axel and co. And I really love how the game essentially starts off with how the first game ended, showing the heroes standing over the defeated Syndicate boss. It has an almost movie-like quality about it and manages to capture the feeling of a continuing journey of a film trilogy that may have been shot back to back. While Axel and Blaze return, the second installment introduces wrestler Max Thunder and Adam's kid brother Eddie Skate Hunter as Mr. X has kidnapped Adam in an attempt to lure out Axel and Blaze and get his revenge. Each of the four characters handles differently as expected, with Axel being the balance type, Blaze the skilled type, Max the power type, and Skate is the speed type, being the weakest yet fastest of the lot. Streets of Rage 2 forgoes the screen-clearing bazooka special and replaces it with individual special attacks for each character that deplete a small amount of health when used, as well as semi-special moves that don't take from your health but serve to add an extra bite to your attacks. The move lists of each character have been improved upon, and this includes the enemies as well, who now also have life gauges, something that was only previously present for the bosses, as well as names. That's right, no longer shall you be beating nameless nobodies into the pavement. Various weapon pickups make their expected return with some minor tweaks. The knife can now be thrown at the player's discretion, and the baseball bat of the first game has been replaced by a katana. But as always, keeping in line with the first game, the gameplay itself is an ode to just how great a beat-em-up can be, as the satisfaction of beating the shit out of these pinheads just doesn't get any better than this. Given the size of the first game and the fact that Streets of Rage 2 is a bigger and more technically accomplished game, in order for the programmers to achieve this game with its added features and additional memory cache, the Mega Drive cartridge specs were improved upon, which in itself is incredibly impressive. Here we had a team of programmers who wanted to make a game for a specific platform, and instead of bending to the limitations of that platform, they actually improved it so they could build the game they wanted to, how they wanted to. Streets of Rage 2's final showdown doesn't have the same level of complexity, structurally speaking in terms of narrative, as the first games, and the battle with Mr. X is essentially the same, although this time around you'll have to face off against his bodyguard Shiva first. It's an enjoyable battle, but in this instance the first game has Streets of Rage 2 beat, as there was nothing quite like, or as surprising for that matter, having to face off against your own teammate in a duel to the death for dominion over the organization you were meant to destroy in the first place. Streets of Rage 3 rounds off this trilogy, and though it's fair to say that it's a far cry from the first game in terms of how it had evolved, this evolution wasn't as balanced as Streets of Rage 2, and even though it gets a lot right, there are also aspects of the game that have taken a step back, and for this reason Streets of Rage 3 is considered to be the weakest installment in the series, despite being of a much higher technical level in terms of its content, narrative and design. Streets of Rage 3 introduced a level of complexity not seen in either of the previous installments, such as a more story-driven narrative, multiple endings, and even a more complex level design, but it's these very aspects that work against it, I think, because it breaks the familiar consistency that players had come to expect by introducing too many changes to the point where it feels a bit removed from the previous installments. The good news is that Streets of Rage 3 is a fantastic looking game, containing all the beautifully impressive locations that one would expect from the series, and it plays just as well as the first two, with the added inclusion of a faster gameplay mechanic by introducing running and vertical dodge moves. The weapon pickups make their return once more, but can only be used a finite amount of times, the upside being that you're able to incorporate the weapons in certain special attacks, so that's quite a cool feature. Series staple Axel Stone and Blaze Fielding make their triumphant return along with Eddie Skate Hunter and newcomer Dr. Zan, an ex-Syndicate cyborg giving him access to a multitude of powerful attacks and turning weapon pickups into energy spheres, and as expected, the gameplay is as fun and satisfying as ever. Mr. X is once again the main antagonist, and this time around, he has started his own research company called RoboPsi Corporation, which acts as a front for his more shady activities. Of course, there's a benefit to having a robotics company, as you will need to face off against various robotic foes including robotic doppelgangers of yourselves. Dr. Dom has been tasked with creating lifelike copies set to replace important city officials so that Mr. X can run the city essentially via remote control. In this instance, I get serious Bond villain vibes off of Mr. X, and with 4 possible endings there are various outcomes of how it all plays out, including an ending where you actually end up fighting a robotic replacement of Mr. X, resulting in an ominous "The End" purporting across the screen. Streets of Rage 3 is often considered to be the toughest of the trilogy, however I found it to actually be the easiest, lest we forget that horrid boss gauntlet of the first game and those fucking twins. The new enemies and bosses will come at you thick and fast. Some familiar faces make a return, as well as plenty new ones such as this creepy samurai, and there are certain parts where the enemies in question take the form of construction equipment, as seen here, or crazed bikers. I must just reiterate how great this game looks. The backgrounds are especially impressive, with an added level of detail not seen in the previous installments. And finally, what would Streets of Rage be, nay dare I say, what would a beat 'em up be without that elevator level, as each installment of the series has one. It's almost like a coming of age event for these types of games. One of the most important, if not the most important, components of the Streets of Rage series has to be the incredibly atmospheric and masterful sound design. Many consider the music to be ahead of its time, and rightly so, as Japanese video game composer and programmer Yuzo Koshiro is regarded as arguably one of the most influential and best chiptune composers in the world. And unlike today, where video game hardware has practically no limitations, creating such impressive soundtracks on systems as limited as the NES, or in this case the Sega Genesis, stands as a true testament to Koshiro's skill. So even though I have looked at all the games comparatively, to me it makes sense to look at the music collectively. I've listened to the soundtrack albums of each game multiple times. They're on my phone, they're on my iPod, and they're also most certainly stored on my PC. I felt it necessary to analyze the music independently from the games. It's not usually something that I would do, but given how popular the tracks are and the fact that they are almost certainly always a topic of conversation when talking about these games, it seemed like a logical step to take. So while Yuzo Koshiro composed the soundtracks of all 3 games, Motohiro Kawashima provided the tracks of the second game as well as almost half of the third game's tracks. This is almost certainly why the first game's music sounds different from the sequels, and why I believe the first game's tracks are the best, despite Streets of Rage 2's soundtrack being hailed as revolutionary. Not to say that it isn't, of course, because the soundtrack is spectacular, just that the first game's tracks sound a bit more atmospheric and richer to me. I mean, does it get any better than that boss music? All 3 soundtracks consist of experimental chiptune-based dance-style music incorporating genres like techno, jungle, breakbeat, house, and electro, and even though Streets of Rage 3's soundtrack is also considered to be ahead of its time, it is the weakest of the 3 in my opinion, swapping out memorable beats for an even more experimental sound and randomly generated sequences that sound a lot more untamed and garage-like than its big brothers. The music for the Streets of Rage series was produced using the Sega Genesis' Yamaha FM Synth sound chip, aka the Yamaha YM2612 sound chip, which you may remember hearing about back in Is It Still Good Today episode 5, responsible for the impressive tunes of Comic Zone. The tracks for Streets of Rage were also created with the assistance of a NEC PC-88 computer alongside Koshiro's own audio programming language called Music Love, which was a modified version of the PC-88's music macro language. It goes without saying that this is all extremely impressive and further proof that Koshiro was a video game music genius. In terms of the actual sound effects found in each game, they too were incrementally improved upon with each installment that was released. So while the kicking and punching sound effects are pretty good in the first Streets of Rage, there's a far more satisfying snap about them in the sequels that further enhances the already spectacular experience of these games, and the guttural sound effects of screams, shouts and so forth seem to be on par with one another across all three titles. In closing, the Streets of Rage series of games are among the best titles available for the Sega Genesis and are quite arguably some of the greatest games ever made too. Sega had created a pedigree of beat 'em up that would be able to hold its own against the likes of Double Dragon, Final Fight and beyond. Over the course of almost 30 years, Streets of Rage has amassed untold amounts of merchandise, ranging from comic books scripted by Mark Miller, to various clothing items and even a multitude of figurines and statues. And if there was ever any doubt as to Streets of Rage's position as a cult phenomenon, there's even a new Streets of Rage sequel in development that proves that the series remains relevant and ingrained in our collective gaming lives even to this day. And with that, I close off the year with Streets of Rage. As always, a big thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up, drop a comment below, and most importantly, subscribe. Have a great Christmas, and I'll see you guys next year. Cheers!